Hello, my name is Jennifer Zeng. I'm an author, a blogger, and recently a YouTuber. I'm also a survivor of China's labor camp system. I gave evidence and testimony to the China Tribunal regarding the forced organ harvesting crime of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. And my involvement in this and my story were widely covered by major media outlets such as BBC, Sky News, The Guardian, Reuters, etc. On June 17th, the China Tribunal delivered its final verdict, saying that
the tribunal members are all certain, unanimously and sure beyond reasonable doubt, that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims.
And commission of crimes against humanity against the Falun Gong and Uyghurs has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. When Sir Geoffrey Nice, the chair of the China Tribunal, delivered the final judgment, I was personally in the court listening. I was particularly struck by some facts and figures he mentioned, which are the voluntary donation system in China, the huge difference between the ratios of registered donors versus eligible donors between China and the US. Basically, according to the tribunal's numbers in 2017 in China, the declared number of registered donors was 375,000, and this resulted in 5,146 eligible donors. So this resulted in a so-called conversion rate of 1.4%. If you divide 5,146 by 375,000. Let's then look at the same numbers of the US, where there exists a transparent and well-established, well-managed organ donation and allocation system. In the US, in the same year, which is 2017, there were 140 million registered donors, and this resulted in 10,824 eligible donors. So the conversion rate is only 0.008%. Why was I particularly struck by these numbers? Because I did some exactly similar calculation and analysis 2 years ago in 2017 with the numbers of 2016. Here I'll skip the numbers I used and the process of my calculation and go directly to this conclusion. Both my calculation and that of the China tribunals came to the same result. China's conversion rate of eligible donors versus registered donors is more than 100 or nearly 200 times higher than the conversion rate of the Americas. What does this mean? It means that the registered donors in China have to be dying more than 100 times or nearly 200 times faster or easier than the registered donors in the US. Or let's put it in another way. The possibility of registered donors in China to die and to become an eligible organ donor is more than 100 times or nearly 200 times higher than that of a registered donor in the US. Is that possible? I think for any reasonable person, it is not possible whatsoever. Either you have to purposely killed the registered donors in China for them to be used for organ transplant, or the numbers or the entire system of the so-called voluntary organ donation system China are all faked. For me, it was crystal clear that the so-called voluntary organ donation system in China was only a crime laundering fabrication when I wrote my article titled alarming figures, calculations, and crime laundering attempts 2 years ago. We've all heard the term and understand very well the concept of money laundering. So to borrow this concept, this so-called China organ donation system can only be called an attempt of crime laundering. Why do I say this? Let's see the titles of 3 contradicting Chinese official reports regarding organ sources first. The title of the first report goes like this: Claims about China is harvesting executed prisoners' organs are sheer lies. This report was published on April 11, 2006, when the crime of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners had just been broken by the Epoch Times. At that time, the CCP didn't want to admit that it was using executed prisoners as organ sources, as they knew that was also against the international norms. The title of the second report goes like this: Health Ministry. Executed prisoners are the main sources for China's organ transplants. This report was published on March 7, 2012, when the crime of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners had become more widely known and was too difficult to cover up. So the CCP chose to admit that they were using executed prisoners instead of killing people on demand for their organs. They thought that if they had to choose between 2 accusations, they'd better choose the less harmful one. So they shamelessly admitted that they had been using executed prisoners, a crime that they had always been furiously denying before. The title of the third report goes like this: Health Ministry. We don't rely on executed prisoners for organ transplants 2 years later. This report was published on March 5, 2013, when the crime of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience had become too difficult to cover up, and when the CCP wanted to create a convincing source to continue with their hugely profitable business of mass killing innocent people for their organs. Given the fraudness of the so-called voluntary donation system in China, one can assume that they are either fabricating the entire thing or they are not just counting the killed as voluntary donors. Even if they did manage to suddenly and miraculously recruit so many donors, they still need to explain the organ sources of transplants they had done prior to the establishment of the so-called donation system. As a matter of fact, investigators of the World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong have conducted a number of investigations regarding the number of registered donors with organ donation registration centers in Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Sichuan, Shenzhen, Anhui, Harbin, etc. Staff from many of these centers complained that they didn't get many registrations or any at all, whilst Tianjin got altogether 170 registered donors in 12 years since their establishment in 2003, while Sichuan province got 150 donations in 4 years up to 2016. However, the purpose for me to do this video is not to talk about how flawed the CCP's organ donation system is, since the very reputable independent China tribunal has already handed out its verdict that the CCP is guilty of mass murder and anti-humanity crime. The purpose for me to create this video is to discuss another very important issue, that is, what kind of a role is the West playing in this anti-humanity crime of the CCPs? If anybody with a math level of a 4th grade primary school student can do such a simple calculation of China's voluntary donation system to find out its fraudness, why were the experts of the Transplant Society so easily be fooled by what they saw at several transplant centers in China? And why did they so easily endorse such a fraud system? I will discuss this important issue in my next video. Thank you for watching, and please do subscribe to and share my channel. See you next time.